The applause was a warm, rolling wave that washed over Chloe Jones as she took her final bow. On stage, under the hot lights of the Seoul Arts Center, she was in control. Her cello, a beautiful, deep-voiced extension of herself, had sung for the packed audience, and they had sung back their approval with thunderous hands. Here, she was understood. Here, she was safe. An hour later, the reality was markedly different. The late autumn air of Seoul was crisp, a sharp contrast to the stifling backstage area. Chloe hugged her coat tighter, the case holding her precious cello a familiar, comforting weight at her side. She declined the after-party invitation, the social exhaustion of being the only black face in the orchestra, often in the entire concert hall, weighing heavier than the instrument she carried. All she wanted was the quiet of her rented apartment and a cup of tea. "Miss Jones." A voice, deep and polite, cut through the quiet hum of the night. A man in an impeccably tailored black suit stood beside a black Genesis sedan, so sleek it seemed to absorb the light around it. He bowed slightly. "Maestro Park sent me. He insisted you not wait for a taxi. He apologizes for not securing your driver sooner." Chloe hesitated. It was odd. But Maestro Park was notoriously forgetful and overly generous in equal measure. The car looked official. The driver was respectful. The long day and the desire to just be home overruled her innate caution. "Thank you," she said, returning a small bow. He opened the rear door for her, carefully placing her cello case on the seat beside her before shutting her in. The interior was silent, chilled, and smelled of leather and sandalwood. She watched the bright lights of Central Seoul fade into the more subdued, elegant avenues of Gangnam. But then the driver turned again, heading not toward her neighborhood in Itaewon, but toward the wooded, exclusive slopes of Bukak Mountain. A cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. "Excuse me? This isn't the way to Itaewon." The driver's eyes met hers in the rearview mirror. They were utterly devoid of emotion. "A change of plans, Miss Jones." "No. Stop the car. Stop the car right now." Her voice rose, panic clawing at her throat. She pulled at the door handle. It was locked, of course. The child-safe locks engaged. She was trapped. The car glided through massive, wrought iron gates that swung open silently and closed just as silently behind them. It came to a stop not at a house, but before a stark, modern structure of concrete, glass, and steel that seemed to be carved into the mountain itself. It was beautiful and utterly terrifying. The door opened. Another man in a suit, broader and more imposing than the driver, stood there. He didn't speak, merely gestured for her to get out. "Where am I? What is this?" Chloe demanded, her voice trembling. She clutched her cello case to her chest like a shield. No answer. The man took her gently but firmly by the elbow, his grip leaving no room for argument, and guided her inside. The entrance was a vast, cavernous space with a ceiling that soared 2 stories high. The floor was polished dark concrete, the walls bare except for one enormous, hauntingly abstract painting. The air was still and cold. It felt more like a museum than a home. A very secure, very private museum. She was led down a long, hushed corridor and into a spacious room. It was elegantly appointed with a comfortable-looking bed, a sofa, and even a bookshelf. A large window showed a breathtaking, dizzying view of Seoul's glittering skyline far below. It was a gilded cage. "You will wait here," the man finally spoke, his voice a low rumble. He placed a phone on the bedside table. "It dials only one number. Use it if you require anything. Do not attempt to leave. It is impossible." The door shut with a soft, definitive click. Chloe ran to it, finding it locked solid. She was a prisoner. For what felt like an hour, she simply stood in the center of the room, shaking, her mind racing in terrified, useless circles. Who? Why? Was it ransom? Her family wasn't wealthy. Was it some horrible mistake? The lock on the door clicked again. It swung open slowly. The man who walked in was not one of the suited guards. He was younger, perhaps in his early 30s, and dressed in a black, impeccably fitted suit that screamed of power and money far beyond the orchestra patrons she was used to. His black hair was swept back flawlessly, and his features were sharp, aristocratic, and devastatingly handsome. But it was his eyes that froze the blood in her veins. They were dark, intense, and held a chilling absence of warmth. He assessed her not as a person, but as an object. A problem. An asset. He stopped a few feet away, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. He didn't need to posture. His aura of absolute authority filled the room. Chloe Jones, he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, a smooth, calm baritone that seemed to vibrate in the silent space between them. It was a voice used to being obeyed. Terror was rapidly being burned away by a white-hot anger. Who are you? What do you want with me? A flicker of something amusement? Annoyance passed through his dark eyes. You may call me Minjun. What I want is simple. You will play for me. Chloe stared at him, bewildered. What? The Elgar, he said, his gaze drifting to the cello case she was still death-gripping. Cello Concerto in E minor. The final movement. You will play it. It was so absurd, so specific, that her fear momentarily subsided. You kidnapped me for a private concert? His eyes snapped back to hers, and the coldness in them made her take an involuntary step back. Do not mistake this for a request. You will play it. Until it is perfect. It is perfect, she fired back, defiance sparking. I just played it for 2,000 people. No, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more threatening than a shout. It was adequate. It was not perfect. You will learn the difference. He took a step closer, and she caught the faint, clean scent of his cologne. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. Your comfort is assured, provided you are cooperative. Cause problems, and your comfort will be the first thing to disappear. Do you understand? Chloe said nothing, her heart hammering against her ribs. She just glared at him, pouring all her hatred and fear into the look. Kim Minjun seemed to accept her silence as assent. He gave one last, lingering look at her cello case, then turned and walked out without another word. The door locked behind him. Chloe sank onto the edge of the bed, her legs giving way. She was the prisoner of a madman. A beautiful, heartless, dangerously powerful madman who had stolen her for the sound of her cello. Alone in the silent, opulent room high above a city that couldn't see her, Chloe Jones began to understand the meaning of true, utter helplessness. And her captor, Kim Minjun, was its elegant, terrifying king. The first night was the longest of Chloe's life. Sleep was a fractured series of nightmares where locked doors and silent, suited men chased her through endless, minimalist hallways. She woke with a start every hour, the unfamiliar silence of the room pressing down on her like a physical weight. The view from the window, a breathtaking tapestry of soul's lights, was no longer beautiful. It was a taunt. Freedom was right there, sparkling in the distance, but utterly out of reach. Morning came, announced not by sunlight, the sky was a flat, pale gray, but by a soft knock on the door. Before she could answer, a different suited guard entered, carrying a tray. He placed it on the table without a word, a traditional Korean breakfast of steaming rice, soup, grilled fish, and an array of banchan. It looked like it belonged in a five-star hotel. The absurdity of it, a gourmet meal served to a prisoner, made her stomach churn. He also placed a stack of neatly folded clothes beside the tray. Expensive-looking black lounge pants and a cashmere sweater. The message was clear, her old life, her own clothes, were gone. She was to be remade to fit the aesthetic of her cage. The guard left, and the lock clicked again. Chloe ignored the food, her hunger drowned out by fear and fury. She spent the morning testing her prison. The window was seamless, impossible to open, and the glass was so thick the city below was utterly silent. The door was a solid slab of reinforced steel masquerading as elegant wood. She was well and truly trapped. Hours bled into one another. The silence was maddening. It was broken in the afternoon by the same soft knock. This time, it was him. Kim Minjun stood in the doorway, changed into a dark gray sweater and trousers that looked impossibly soft and expensive. He looked more like a ruthless CEO at a weekend retreat than a kidnapper. His eyes scanned the room, noting the untouched tray of food with a slight, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. You did not eat. It wasn't a question. It was an observation of a flawed variable in his equation. I'm not hungry, Chloe said, her voice hoarse from disuse. She remained on the bed, drawing her knees to her chest, making herself small. You will need your strength, he stated, his tone devoid of any concern for her well-being. It was purely practical. An instrument must be maintained. He walked over to where her cello case stood propped against the wall. "For your work." "It's not my work," she snapped, the defiance from the previous night flickering back to life. "I'm not performing for you. You can't keep me here." Minjun turned to look at her, and the sheer intensity of his gaze pinned her in place. He didn't rage or threaten. He simply exuded an aura of absolute capability. "I can. And I am. The sooner you accept the reality of your situation, the less difficult it will be for you." He gestured to the cello. "The Elgar." "No." The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. He took 2 slow steps toward the bed, and Chloe instinctively shrank back. He stopped, a predator recognizing the fear of its prey. A faint, cold smile touched his lips. It didn't reach his eyes. "There are 2 ways this can proceed, Chloe," he said, her name a soft, dangerous sound on his lips. "You can play for me in this room, where you are comfortable, well-fed, and unharmed. Or," he paused, letting the alternative hang in the air, "my men can take you to one of the sublevels of this building. It is less comfortable. The acoustics are poor. But you will still play. The choice is yours." It was no choice at all. It was a beautifully delivered ultimatum. The threat wasn't violence against her, not directly, but the removal of the fragile, terrifying comfort of this gilded cage. The thought of being taken down into some dark, cold basement, surrounded by his silent, brutal men, was a fear so primal it made her blood run cold. Tears of frustration and helplessness welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give him the satisfaction. With a shaking breath, she uncurled herself from the bed and walked on unsteady legs to her cello case. Her hands trembled as she unbuckled the latches and lifted the instrument out. The familiar feel of the wood against her fingers was a small, painful comfort. It was a piece of her old life, here in this nightmare. She didn't look at him. She positioned the cello, tightened the bow, and placed it on the strings. She played the first, mournful notes of the Elgar's final movement. The sound, rich and resonant, felt alien in the cold, sterile room. She played mechanically, pouring her anger and fear into the music, making it sharp and biting. She played for the guard who had tricked her, for the silent men who stood outside her door, for the breathtaking view that mocked her. She played for him. When the final note faded into the tense air, she finally dared to look up. Minjun had not moved. He was watching her, his head slightly tilted. His expression was unreadable, but his intense focus was entirely on her. For a long moment, he said nothing. Again, he commanded, his voice slow. "The phrasing in the Adagio passage is too hurried. You are rushing through the grief. It is not an emotion to be escaped. It is to be inhabited." Chloe stared at him, stunned. His critique was that of a master conductor, precise and utterly unexpected. This wasn't the comment of a thug who wanted background music. This was the demand of a man who understood the soul of the piece intimately. He wasn't just a dangerous man. He was a dangerous man with a discerning, obsessive ear. And he was listening to every note, every breath, every shift of her finger on the string. Her captivity had just become infinitely more complex. Her jailer was also her audience, and his attention felt more invasive than any lock on the door. The silence after his critique was more unnerving than any threat. Chloe could only stare, her bow hovering over the strings. He had dissected her performance with a surgeon's precision, targeting the most vulnerable, most personal part of her interpretation. "You are rushing through the grief." It felt like he had looked directly into her soul. "How would you know?" The question was out before she could stop it, laced with a defiance she didn't truly feel. A shadow passed over Minjun's face, so brief she might have imagined it. The cold, impenetrable mask returned instantly. "I know," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. He didn't move from his position by the door, a statue of controlled power. Again, from the Adagio. Her hands were still trembling, but now it was from a volatile mix of fear and a strange, professional indignation. Who was he to critique her? A criminal. A kidnapper. Yet, his comment had been correct. In her fear and anger, she had rushed it, using the music's technical demands as a shield against its emotional onslaught. Swallowing her pride, she placed the bow back on the string. She closed her eyes, shutting him out, trying to find the center of the piece. She played the passage again, slower, letting the profound sorrow of Elgar's composition wash over her. She thought of her family and ocean away, of the terrifying isolation of this room, of the grief of her stolen freedom. The notes became heavier, more resonant. She played for herself this time, using the music as her only possible outlet for the maelstrom inside her. When she finished, the room felt different. The air was charged. She opened her eyes. Minjun was still watching her, but his intensity had shifted. It was less analytical, more absorbed. He didn't speak for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on her as if seeing her for the first time. "Better," he finally said. The single word was grudging, but it was not a lie. He pushed off from the doorframe. "You will practice. The entire movement. I will return this evening." He left without another word, the lock engaging behind him. Chloe let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, her body slumping in exhaustion. The interaction had been bizarre and emotionally draining. He was a paradox, a man who could order her imprisonment without a flicker of remorse yet could pinpoint the emotional authenticity of a musical phrase with the skill of a seasoned critic. The day passed in a strange new rhythm. Her meals were delivered lunch, then dinner, each a silent, exquisite affair. She ate now, the encounter having strangely jump-started her hunger. Resistance required energy. In the afternoon, she practiced. Not because he ordered her to, but because it was the only thing that felt normal. The music was her anchor, the one thing in this nightmare that still belonged to her. She lost herself in the familiar patterns, the physicality of drawing the bow, the pressure of her fingers on the fingerboard. For minutes at a time, she could almost forget where she was. Evening descended, painting the cityscape outside her window in shades of deep indigo and gold. Right on time, the lock clicked. Minjun entered. He had changed again, into black trousers and a simple black shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing taut forearms. He carried nothing. He simply walked to the sofa positioned across from her and sat down. He didn't look at her. He stared out at the city, waiting. The unspoken command was clear. Taking a steadying breath, Chloe lifted her cello. This time, she didn't play out of defiance or fear. She played for the music itself. She poured every ounce of her skill into the concerto, navigating its technical challenges and its emotional depths. She played the entire final movement, from the explosive opening chords to the heartbreaking, resigned whisper of its conclusion. The final note faded into the room's perfect acoustics. Silence. Minjun didn't move. He didn't clap. He didn't speak. He continued to look out the window, but his focus was turned inward. Several long moments passed. Chloe didn't dare break the silence, unsure of what she had unleashed. Finally, he turned his head. His expression was unreadable, but the harsh lines of his face seemed slightly softened in the dim evening light. The staccato in the fifth bar after the tempo change, he said, his voice quiet, almost a murmur. It is too aggressive. It is not an attack. It is a punctuation of despair. A hesitation. Chloe's breath caught in her throat. He wasn't just listening. He was memorizing. He was analyzing every bar, every note, with an obsessive, terrifying focus. He was treating her performance like a complex business deal, searching for every flaw to be corrected, every variable to be optimized. But the flaw he was searching for wasn't in a financial report. It was in her art. In her. Why? The word escaped her, a desperate plea for understanding. Why are you doing this? Why this piece? His eyes met hers, and for a fraction of a second, she saw something flicker in their dark depths, a pain so profound and well hidden it was almost immediately extinguished. The mask of the ruthless Chable slammed back into place. That is not your concern, he said, his voice returning to its cold, commanding tone. He stood up, straightening his shirt. Your concern is the music. Nothing else. He walked to the door but paused with his hand on the handle. He didn't look back at her. The hesitation, he repeated. Fix it. He left, and Chloe was alone again, but the room felt different. It was no longer just a prison. It had become a practice room for a captor whose obsession she couldn't begin to understand. The threat was no longer just physical confinement. It was this intimate, invasive dissection of her very soul, note by painful note. And the most terrifying part was that a small, traitorous part of her, the musician part, knew he was right. The command hung in the air long after he was gone. Fix it. Chloe sat in the echoing silence, her cello still resting against her. The instrument, once her greatest source of solace, now felt like a tool of her subjugation. He wasn't just demanding she play, he was demanding she reshape her art to fit his exacting, incomprehensible standards. The hesitation he mentioned wasn't a technical flaw, it was an interpretive choice, one she'd made deliberately. To have it criticized by him felt like a violation. For 2 days, a stubborn silence settled over her. She didn't touch the cello. She ate the meals left for her. She stared out at the city. She slept fitfully. It was a silent protest, the only one she could muster. She waited for his return, mentally rehearsing her defiance. But he didn't come. His absence was somehow more unnerving than his presence. It made the space feel larger, her isolation more complete. The silent guards who brought her food offered nothing, their faces impassive masks. The only sound was the hum of the climate control and the frantic beat of her own heart. The inactivity was maddening. The silence began to press in on her, and the memory of his critique started to itch at the back of her mind. On the third morning, driven by a potent mix of boredom and a compulsive need to prove him wrong, she finally gave in. She opened the case with a sigh that was almost a sob of defeat. She played the passage. Over and over. She played it with aggression. She played it with sorrow. She played it exactly as she always had. And each time, she heard his voice. It is not an attack. It is a punctuation of despair. A hesitation. Frustrated, she put the bow down. What did he want? What was the difference between a sharp, angry staccato and a despairing one? It was all in the pressure, the speed of the bow, the slightest relaxation of the finger. An idea, dangerous and unbidden, crept into her mind. What if she didn't play it with confidence? What if she let the note break, just a little, as if the bow itself was unsure? As if the musician's will was faltering? Tentatively, she tried it. She attacked the note but pulled the bow away a fraction of a second too soon, letting the sound cut off with a breathy, imperfect sigh. The effect was instantaneous. The musical phrase didn't sound weaker, it sounded heartbroken. It was a gasp of pain instead of a shout of anger. It was undeniably more profound. She sat back stunned. He was right. Kim Min-jun, the heartless kidnapper, was right about the music. The realization was a seismic shift. It didn't make him less terrifying. If anything, it made him more so. His understanding was not academic, it was visceral. He wasn't just a man who liked classical music. He was a man who understood the language of pain intimately enough to correct its translation. That evening, the lock clicked. Her heart leapt into her throat. He entered, dressed in another impeccably tailored suit, looking as if he'd just come from a boardroom where he'd decided a company's fate. His eyes went immediately to the cello in her hands, a silent question. Without a word, without being asked, Chloe lifted her bow. She played the entire movement again. But this time, when she reached the contentious bar, she let her bow hesitate. She created the punctuation of despair. She finished and kept her eyes fixed on the floor between them, her chest tight. She couldn't bear to look at him. The silence stretched. Then, she heard the soft rustle of fabric. She looked up. Min-jun had taken a single step into the room. His hands were still in his pockets, but his posture was less rigid. His gaze was fixed on her, intense and unblinking. Yes, he said, the single word low and resonant. It wasn't praise. It was an acknowledgement of a corrected error. A satisfied conclusion. But it was more than she'd ever gotten from him before. He didn't leave immediately. He stood there, watching her, as if seeing the person behind the performance for the first time. You understood the assignment, he stated. It was a good note, Chloe replied, her voice barely a whisper. She wasn't sure why she said it. Maybe to reclaim some sliver of ownership over her own talent. A faint, almost imperceptible line appeared between his brows. It is not about good or bad, he said, his tone not unkind, but instructional. It is about truth. So much of the world is a lie. The music, it must not be. The statement was so unexpected, so philosophical coming from him, that Chloe could only stare. In that moment, he wasn't the mafia boss. He was a man revealing a sliver of his core belief, a fanatical devotion to an authenticity he found nowhere else. He seemed to realize he had said too much. The shutters came down behind his eyes, and the cold, impenetrable mask returned. He gave a curt nod. You will practice the entire concerto. Not just the final movement, he commanded, turning to leave. I will listen tomorrow. He left, and the door locked. Chloe remained on her chair, her mind reeling. The interaction had been devoid of warmth, yet it felt like the first real communication they'd had. He had given her a glimpse, however brief, of the obsession that drove him. He wasn't just a collector of beautiful things, he was a hunter of truths, and for reasons she couldn't fathom, he believed her music held one. Her gilded cage now had a purpose, to perform truth for a man who lived a life of lies. And the most dangerous part was that she was starting to understand the assignment.